Hey, it's Tim. Welcome back to Wandering Tiny Home. I
I'm
have,
V.
oh, I did it again.
Wow. And this as well.
Talking about tiny homes. Anybody could put them anywhere, right?
Not
No.
really. You really want to check with your local authorities, your city, your county, your state, just to make sure you're allowed to put a tiny house where you're planning to do it before you invest in the actual purchase of your tiny home.
So that's today's topic, zoning and regulations. So thanks for coming in today. Let's go ahead and start talking about what are the common zoning restrictions of tiny homes.
Well, so you got a lot of things, really. I mean, a tiny house is considered tiny because of the square footage. So typically, it's under 400 square feet, which may not be allowed wherever you are too. So that's the
Yep.
first thing you need to check. There's also whether or not your structure has to be on a permanent foundation. I actually heard of someone who purchased a tiny house and had it on their property, and then an inspector came out and they had to try to figure out how to put a tiny house on wheels onto an actual foundation, which is a bit of a tricky situation. So
It sounds like it.
make sure you've got all your ducks in a row before you do that. And then the other end, you also want to check whether or not you're allowed to do a tiny house on wheels. Maybe you need to just do what's called an ADU, which would be like a tiny house on skids instead of a tiny house on wheels. So um, doing that, and also depending on what you're going to be using the tiny house for, if it's going to be your permanent resident, there's different rules for that as opposed to maybe you're going to put it on Airbnb or something like that, or it's just going to be a little guest house. So you definitely want to check all the fine print before you go down the road of trying to put a tiny house on your property.
Which is all true. Not all platforms are equal for the type of tiny home you're going to have. Like on wheels and also the ADU, which we consider as our skid unit based models. And how do we want to be able to find those codes and to really apply for our tiny homes? And looking at that, you have the International Residential Code, the IRC. There are each of the different states that you go to. You also have to think of your county. Then you have to think of your community, and then you have to bylaws through the federal. Then all this comes down and says, do you have the appropriate requirements to meet? So we wanted to go through this because when people get tiny homes, they don't want to be able to say, wait, I didn't know about this. And for us to keep up with it, or any tiny home company to keep up with it, it's very complex. So we do want to help teach people how to get there. And let's kind of think about those bullet points. Like, to me, that's like the ceiling height. We got loft safety regulations and also the egress requirements. And for those thinking like, okay, well, how important is that? Like, well, if there's a fire in your home, you need to have the ability to get out of it.
Well, the great thing about purchasing a tiny house from Wandering Tiny Homes is that we are members of NOAA, which is the National Organization of Alternative Housing. And when we build our units, whether it's a tiny house on skids or a tiny house on wheels, we use NOAA while we're building. They're kind of like our building inspectors. So when you've
Mm-hmm.
purchased a house for us, it's going to meet all of those IRC building codes that are you would be required with your in order to make sure it has egress. Do the stairs have proper safety rails? Does
Yep.
the loft have proper safety rails? Different things like that. So you can be assured that we've sort of dotted those I's and crossed those T's for you because our homes are NOAA certified.
Yeah, that is extremely true. And to us, that's also made it much more easier for when you're working with your state and regulations, but also when you want to get insurance. And also if you want to get a mortgage, to have these, safety checks be able to be applied. And then as we're going through that different 5 stages that we have to go through just to get the notice certification. So it isn't a one stamp done.
No.
All
I
right.
also think it's important to remember that when people are considering these too, I mean, you can look up a lot of these regulations and things online, but when you're looking at your county, your city, your federal and state, it's not like federal reigns supreme, then state, then county, then your local, then whatever locality you have. What the way the regulations work is that if the county has a regulation that is more stringent than the federal, then it takes precedence over the federal statutes. And so just because the feds say, hey, we require this, your county of, DuPont County may require something that's much more intricate than that. And understanding those codes are really important when you're going to install and permanently affix your tiny home. And really the best way to do that is to work closely with your building department, because they will have their inspectors who understand all the codes that are applicable to the area of which these people live in. And they'll be able to tell you, well, yes, your federal code says this, but our county code says this. You need to make sure that you do X, Y, and Z in order for this home to be able to be permitted on your property.
Yeah, that's a good point. You definitely want to make sure you're all good with your local authorities, because they're the ones that are going to come out and shut you down. Federal is not going to be the one coming out, knocking on your door saying you're not allowed to have this here, So definitely going into, even if you've done your research online, just going into the actual office and saying, hey, this is what I want to do. Can I do this before I start, spending my money to set it all up?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's coming down to like how you can work with your local regulations. Let's do a quick recap on that. We'll set it on point. Contacting your city zoning office. Check your state and county websites. Join the local tiny home advocacy groups are another option as well. This way you can be able to learn from someone who's already done it, and then also be able to make sure that we kind of help you be able to apply to like what is permitted, and then consult with also a real estate attorney. Those are someone else that you can possibly look into for helping out and getting that guidance.
Yeah, and once again, those are it all depends on what you are planning on using that tiny house for. Yeah. So, when you're thinking about the legalities of your tiny house, the great thing about something like, if you're going to do Airbnb, they have a whole insurance policy that kind of covers all that sort of rental stuff. So that's, if you're looking at this as an investment purpose, definitely going through Airbnb. They sort of do a lot of that for you. They protect you in case of loss and theft, and people getting hurt on your property. This kind of a big blanket insurance policy for you. That's part of the rental fees that your clients pay when they rent your little tiny house.
Yeah, so let's go back into this real quick about the regulations between different states. There are some states that are more permitted, more accepting of tiny homes. And from what we noticed is, California, Oregon, and Texas, they are tiny home friendly, allowing a lot of the ADUs and tiny home communities to be more flourishing and also more populous within those areas and states.
Another one is also North Carolina, very tiny house friendly. Florida and Colorado too are very tiny house friendly too.
Definitely, yeah. So we are seeing more states being interested in actually opening up to where tiny home communities are coming in, especially with the current economics today. And then taking to the opposite side of that coin, there are stricter zoning laws in different states. We're just going to say amount like New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Often require larger minimum square footage to be considered as part of your home. So the 400 square feet for a tiny home that we, as part of that tiny home community, wouldn't be applicable to those areas. So make sure, that's why we wanted to say, check your regulations, check your zoning, because if you get a tiny home and you go to these different states that don't allow it, then you have to consider what's the next step for you. And then some states that do allow the tiny homes on wheels and RVs, they have a limiting full-time residency options. So think about that, is that if you're going to be someone who's going to be a snowbird, is that could be something where if you had that limited time, would that be considered for you a good benefit, because you're going to live up north during the summer seasons but move south during the winter seasons. And then something also put onto there too is like, hey, and Will, I was thinking about this one, is about the legal considerations for living in a tiny home on wheels. That falls underneath the RV regulations.
Yeah, tiny house and will quite often, but once again, it all depends on where you live and where it's going to be parked.
Hmm.
If you're parking your tiny house on wheels in one of these tiny home communities, they are set up to where it can be your full time residence.
Yeah.
But you can also put one of these in like any RV park, and then you kind of are subject to that 6 month type living situation, which, like I said, is ideal for a snowbird that's sort of spending half a year up north and half a year down south.
Yeah. And there's also that RV certifications that's needed for safety compliance. And if you look at that too, that needs to also be provided to certain states, not each state, because not all states are equal in that. That they do require you to have insurance and registration completed.
Yeah.
And that's just so that you can be able to use this as your place of residency.
Yeah, and then once again, just circling back to NOAA as well. Like NOAA actually has stricter um, rules and regulations than even RVIA, which is the governing body for RVs. So there's a lot of protections that you get by having a NOAA certified tiny home.
That's very true. So let's get into the next one. I want to talk about what is the process to get a permit for a tiny home. And that's something that everybody talks about. Like, you got to be this, you got to be that, but how do I do it? So let's talk about this a little bit more at a 5,000 foot level. To do this, checking your zoning laws. Let's recap again what Will said earlier. It comes from your federal, goes to your state, goes to your community, and also your county, and you have to understand how that works together. And then submitting your building plans if you desire to do to where you have foundation put down, and then you have to understand about, I'm going to have to think about electric, I'm going to have to think about sewage, and I'm going to have to think about water. And those come with requirements to each of the states that you live in. Following those helps you to make sure that you're in compliance instead of you getting some kind of penalty because you didn't follow some kind of law. But those laws are put in place because there are some safety concerns.
Yeah, and that's a really important thing to when you're starting down this process of checking your zoning laws. When you start, once you figure out, okay, yes, I am allowed to put a tiny house on wheels on my property, or yes, I am allowed to put a skid-based unit on my property. Then you start looking at your infrastructure, looking at your electrical, your plumbing. Are you doing like a septic, or
Yeah.
are you able to tap into a city sewer? If you're doing a septic, then you've got to get like a perk test and make sure you're even allowed to put septic on your property. If you have to get that done. Those are all definitely steps you need to take before you even start down the process of getting your tiny house built. But as far as inspections go, because our units are not built on site, you don't have to get a building permit for the structure, but you would want to get all the necessary permits for your infrastructure. And once it's on site, then you may have to look at tie downs and things like that, since it's not going to be on a foundation.
I think another thing to consider too is when you are trying to place your tiny home, a lot of communities introduce bylaws and codes and things like that to also keep an aesthetic in the community, and that's really one thing to consider. It's the reason why a lot of HOAs, when you go to a certain town, won't let you put flower beds in your windows because they don't want that aesthetic to look the same, or they will only allow you to paint your house certain colors because they want the aesthetic to be cohesive among the entire neighborhood. And when you're looking at placing your tiny home, you also need to consider the fact of, there's a certain way that the people who establish these neighborhoods and things like that will want their neighborhood to look. Do they want to have freestanding structures in a backyard or even on a property that has an acre or more to it? Or is that something that they want to stay away from because they don't want people who are transient coming in and things like that? They don't want you renting out spaces and things like that. So it's really important to understand those dynamics when placing your tiny home as well, is how does it fit in to the area that you're trying to put that tiny home in.
True, which is part of that submitting your building plans, letting them to be able to validate that this is something that will be what we want within our community. But also kind of keep in mind too that we've talked about how do you be able to work with your company as starting it off, but the next steps, even after you get your infrastructure done and get the tiny home put there, we also recommend scheduling inspections just to ensure that you are in compliance within your state and on your community and your county and your federal. It's almost like lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! I mean, but those are the reasons that we want to make sure that think about these things as you start, pondering, should I have a tiny home for myself? And once you get that final approval, that's like a big lift. That's like I've done everything I need to. This isn't any different from you building a 1,300 square feet house. You have to go through the same process. You have to go and validate, does this work well within like what I'm trying to build? Does the community want to accept it? Foundation, the wiring, the plumbing off the infrastructure grid that exists today, and then be able to make sure that they're in some sort of compliance. If not, there are violations that they do get penalized.
Yeah, I mean, you may find that if you didn't go through the proper steps, having to have your structure removed from your property. So I would say if there's an HOA where you're trying to put this structure, that's going to be a real uphill battle for you.
Yeah.
If you've got a piece of property sort of out, in the countryside somewhere, it's going to be much, much easier to get that approved and be able to do a tiny house.
Very true. I mean, you also have landlord-tenant laws too, and then that's a great call out with the HOA because not all HOAs are going to be very accepting, or really at all, because they're expecting a certain aesthetic to that community.
Well, and also keep in mind too, making sure that there's even access to where you want to put your tiny house. The last thing you want to do is have this thing built and then find out that you're going to have to spend thousands of dollars to have a crane put it in your backyard because you don't have access to where you want to put it.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that you want to sort of check off before you even, order your tiny house.
Very true. But what are the rules regarding tiny home communities? We just talked about living on an HOA and non-HOA.
It's really like the Wild West, honestly. Still, I mean, it's as diverse as it is. The zoning laws that we've already discussed. Between your city and your county and stuff like that. So it's would be the whole thing. You're just doing it on a larger basis. Now, if you're going in somewhere that's already, a good way to, if you're looking at doing a tiny house community, is look at purchasing like an old RV park or something like that. That's a good way to sort of plan out, and jump through a lot of hoops because it's already been zoned usually for some kind of commercial thing. All your infrastructure's there. So that's a really good way to sort of look at establishing a community.
Yep.
But, once again, it's in doing 10 houses and doing one house is a lot of the same process, really. You got to start at your city level, your county level, and go on and make sure you've got everything you need.
Yeah, because the density of land, and then also how you plan to use that land too. And then you also have to look into other pieces to this as well, is that if you think about your infrastructure based upon the land, can you do underground? Can you do overwire?
Yeah.
All this comes into, if you're looking at like the homes for tiny homes itself, like the community based. And I think another piece to this too, which is really important, is that you have to think about if you build a tiny home on your own and you try to meet to whatever you want based upon your vision, we're not stopping you from doing it, but you get what you build.
Yeah.
And in our case, we have specialists that are going to follow these NOAA compliance rules, and also this helps with be able to make sure when you take this to community, you're not going to have like your artistic flair of like, wow, that's an amazing eyeball catcher or an eyesore. And also, we don't know how well you did your electrical work or your plumbing work, because that could be a fire hazard, and fire does spread. And we also want to put in that for consideration. Be careful if you decide to go on your own venture. We're not telling you not to, but if you want to save yourself from those headaches, come to us. We'll love to work with you and talk about what's the best way for moving forward. What are the future predictions for tiny homes regulation? And then also, how can you be an advocate for that too?
I would definitely think, there's a lot of advocacy groups already out there. So there's, the tiny house movement has been going for, quite a few years now, and it's still gaining traction, and they're getting more and more accepted all over the place. Like you said, as the economics of it makes it more sense for people to be able to do. So definitely looking at your local area to see if there's already people who are engaged in the fight of getting tiny homes allowed in your area. And if not, then once again, that's another thing. I mean, you're already going to the office, the planning office, see if you're allowed to do it. Then you can say, hey, talk to them about, are there plans to maybe loosen up the regulations or the zoning laws, talking to your elected officials and getting them on your side. That's what they're there for.
Definitely, quiet lobbying is really the biggest thing. Just talk about, if you can find a group that's there, which just be said, that's very true. This helps to know the engagement. If there isn't a group there, be the voice. Start asking about it. Inquire, like, what can we do to allow alternative living and living into a minimalist lifestyle be more accepted within your community? And then talking to your city officials, going to this town meetings, and then also finding petitions that can help out to get signatures for your, as your state and also your community leaders can be able to see like the importance behind it. Because if you look at the economic times in the last 20 years, the $160,000 house is now $420,000. And, is there any thoughts of this to be going down and reach that again? No, I don't foresee it.
No.
So there is plenty of growth that's happening within the price points of a house. So that's why we're also saying tiny homes. There's much more options that we could do to help out with finding people in alternative living, minimalist lifestyle, nomad lifestyle. Also, for someone who's like me, I'm not interested into having, a big home when my hip's going out. I really don't.
Yeah.
I want to have a nice, comfortable home where I can be able to have 400 square feet, do what the things I need to do, but not feel like I have to worry about the constant cleaning, the constant whatever, the honey-do list never ends. Sorry, wife. I didn't mean to put you under the bus on that one.
Well, in this, I keep coming back to Noah over and over again, but they are also another really great source for finding out about the local advocacy groups, and they are on the front lines. They are engaged on all multiple levels of trying to get zoning laws changed so that tiny homes are more acceptable in more areas around the country. So they are, they're more than just our inspectors. They are a whole organization that their whole goal is to make tiny homes accessible for everyone. So that's a really great resource for you to be able to use. And it's, you don't have to be a member of NOAA to be able to access all their resources and their information and the different links that they have on their site as well. Please, if you have questions or think topics that you want to hear discussed about tiny homes, please send them to us. We'd love to get your suggestions. We'd love to talk about anything to do with tiny homes.
That is on our contact page at wanderingtinyhomes.com. And also we have our phone number there as well. Both me and Will are here for you too.
All right.
All right. And then just to recap again, guys, we hope to take your wandering dreams and make them a wandering adventure. Do that. It's always one tiny step at a time. We thank you for everything and have a great day.
See ya.